As the end of the 6th season approaches, now is the time to reflect back on how the madness all began. Hold the door, folks, because today we are breaking down A Song of Ice and Fire, Book 1, A Game of Thrones by the Numbers. A Game of Thrones is the first book in George R.R. Martin's enthralling fantasy epic, A Song of Ice and Fire. Although the series was originally conceived as a trilogy, Martin has since expanded the story to encompass a projected 7 novels, and it isn't hard to see why. Although A Game of Thrones is the shortest installment published to date, it is by no means an insignificant work. The US paperback edition is over 700 pages long, containing 73 chapters and nearly 300,000 words. Chapters range in length from 1,717 words to 7,373 words, with an average length of 4,050 words. Although there is a significant variance, chapters tend to be longer later in the book. An alternative, quadratic model, shows the peak average chapter length about where one would expect to find the climax of a traditional narrative arc. For those of you who are familiar with statistics, both models are significant according to an ANOVA test, although neither produces an R-squared value above 20%. Similar models showed no significant relationship between the character points of views and chapter length. A Game of Thrones is narrated from a third-person limited perspective. Points of view alternate chapter to chapter between each of 8 reoccurring characters, in addition to a Night's Watchman whose point of view is only used in the prologue. This diagram shows the number of chapters associated with each character. Eddard Stark's point of view is the most frequently used, which may be surprising given that he is executed before the end of the book. However, if we consider the events of A Game of Thrones as primarily expositional, with Ned's death being the inciting incident of the overarching story of A Song of Ice and Fire, then it makes sense that Eddard would be the main character of this quasi-prequel. Catelyn Stark is the next most oft-used point of view. Like her husband, Ned, she is a character whose actions play a crucial role in initiating events, although she herself becomes less important as the series progresses. Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, and Daenerys Targaryen each have relatively high numbers of chapters. This seems appropriate given that these are 3 of the most important protagonists of the later novels. Surprisingly, Arya Stark, who becomes a prominent character later in the series, has the least number of chapters out of the reoccurring POVs. However, this may be indicative of the fact that, like the overarching narrative, Arya's character growth and independent story arc do not fully begin until after her father's death. The next 2 diagrams illustrate the frequency with which chapters with certain points of view reoccur in the same order. Although some such pairings are unique, the majority occur on 2 or more occasions. Taking this analysis one step further, however, we see that only 5 3-chapter sequences occur more than once. That Eddard Stark's point of view is included in all of these may simply be the result of his greater number of chapters, but likely also reflects his importance to the narrative. It is also informative to consider the number of chapters devoted to each family. The Starks have the overwhelming majority, but this is not surprising, given that Tyrion represents the only Lannister point of view, and Dany the only Targaryen. We can examine the reoccurrence of chapters in the same order based on family associations. However, this analysis is skewed by the disproportionate representation of the Starks. To account for this, it is possible to normalize the comparison by dividing the number of pairings by the total number of chapters associated with each house. In the first case, this yields the percentage of chapters associated with a given house, which are followed by chapters associated with a second house. Thus, we see that 100% of Lannister chapters are followed by Stark chapters, but only 13% of Stark chapters are followed by Lannister chapters. The second case yields the inverse, the percentage of chapters associated with a given house which follow chapters from a second house. Thus, 100% of Targaryen chapters follow Stark chapters, but only 13% of Stark chapters follow Targaryen chapters. Combining these two statistics yields a chapter pair index, which represents the frequency of character pairings normalized according to the total family representation. This final comparison shows a balance between the various pairings, indicative of Martin's balanced distribution of narrators and his ability to sustain interest by presenting a variety of storylines throughout the book. This final chart shows the frequency of occurrence of the 100 most common words in A Game of Thrones. As we might expect, the majority of these are common words, articles, conjunctions, prepositions, and so forth. Although these contain no narrative information, they yield some insight into Martin's writing style. For example, excepting proper nouns, none of the 100 most commonly used words are archaic or invented, indicating a fairly modern and direct usage of language. The most common word in the book is the, with over 17,000 occurrences. Although A Game of Thrones features several prominent female protagonists and antagonists, the language is still gender uneven, as masculine pronouns are used more than twice as often as their feminine counterparts. Excluding common words, many of the words that appear most frequently in A Game of Thrones are formal titles and proper nouns. Sir and Lord are most common, speaking to the socio-political culture of Westeros. Jon Snow is the character most frequently referred to by name, followed shortly by Ned Stark. This supports theories that name Ned as the main character of A Game of Thrones, and Jon as the main character of A Song of Ice and Fire overall. Next come Tyrion Lannister and Bran Stark, both cripples and secondary characters who take on greater prominence and importance as the series progresses. Finally, Catelyn, Arya, and Sansa Stark's names are also amongst the 100 most frequently used words in the book. Conspicuously, Daenerys Targaryen is the only reoccurring point-of-view character whose name is not included in the 100 most frequently used words. However, this may reflect less on the importance of her character and more on the variety of names that she accumulates throughout the book. In addition to proper nouns and common words, terms describing relationships, especially familial or honor-bound relationships, are also used in high frequency. This speaks to the culture of the world Martin created, as well as to one of the main themes of his story.